Hi, I'm Celeste Licorish from Hamilton Community Foundation, and welcome to Vital Signs, the show where we talk about the many aspects of community life that make our city vibrant and inclusive. And today, we have the great pleasure of having guests from the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic. They were here last year during Canada 150, but we're going to be talking a lot about truth and reconciliation and how we as a city, as a community, can reconcile and make peace with Indigenous issues that affect all of us. I'm really pleased to have with me today Hugh Tye, who's the Executive Director of the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, and Lyndon George, who is the Indigenous Justice Coordinator at the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic. Welcome back.
Thank you
you
very
were both
much.
here last year.
Thank you.
So
Glad to be here.
before we get started, we're going to start with the traditional acknowledgement.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask Hugh to take us through that.
Happy to do that. I think it's really important when we start any kind of a public event in particular to acknowledge the land upon which we are meeting and to acknowledge the caretakers of that land, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous groups that have made Hamilton or this territory their home. We want to acknowledge and honor the ancestors of the traditional lands that we meet on. We also want to strive to work collaboratively to keep the importance of our shared history and friendship and future relationships in our minds and our hearts. So this is something that's we're having a lot of discussion about in this community and in many other communities.
I notice it more and more when you go to events and things, that it's the way that we welcome, or it's the way that the whole event is started.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's a reminder and an acknowledgement that we are occupying stolen lands.
Right.
So that's maybe the beginning of the discussion, and it also sets a framework for whatever that event is going to be. So it's in the front of our minds throughout, and it permeates the conversation. So it's really
it's interesting
important.
because a lot of the time it starts, but then there's no way to discuss it or talk about the meaning behind it.
Right.
It just starts and it sits there.
Yeah.
So this is an opportunity to maybe go into a little bit more of
I think as well, Celeste, that it provokes thought for people. It helps people to start hopefully investigating where they're at, the land that they're on, contact, and then perhaps look at our shared history in Canada as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and how we've gotten to the place we are today. Land acknowledgements are a great start for anybody who's looking at any form of turning reconciliation into reconciliation, because it's a discovery that we're making across Canada. Excuse me while I get rid of this bug here. We have a history in Canada that isn't always so beautiful, but it needs to be recognized in order for us to move forward. And so the land acknowledgements for Indigenous people, traditionally what we would do is Anishinaabe people from the community that I come from, Chippewas, Caddo, and Stony Point First Nation, we understand that historically when we would travel abroad, either in Canada or the U.S., without those boundaries, that if we were going to be traveling across another nation's territory, we acknowledge the territory, and we acknowledge that there are caretakers to that territory. And so we have done that for thousands of years and existent here as ancient societies. Right. So we know our relationship to the land. We know our responsibilities to the land. So it seems appropriate that these land acknowledgements come from our allies so that they become accustomed to the territories that they're traveling across.
So in this particular instance, Hugh would, as the ally, be the one to state the land acknowledgement, acknowledging that he is on, or we are on, occupying territory that is stolen
Absolutely.
land. Yeah.
And I think Hugh brings up a really important fact that Canadians need to acknowledge and understand, that prior to contact, we we had flourishing and wonderful communities, and how much of this land has come to be occupied was through stealing the land, through stolen land. And it's important to acknowledge that history, that Indigenous groups across Canada didn't freely just come up to settlers as they were settling and say, hey, take our land. That's kind of not what happened. They were removed from the land.
Right.
It's also a reminder, Celeste, that we are all treaty people. And I think very often non-Indigenous people in this country think of it as an Indian problem or an Indian issue. And it isn't. As has been discussed in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it is a Canadian issue. We are all subject to treaties across this country.
So maybe you can take us back to what the Truth and Reconciliation report that was ratified in 2015, as I recall, where it left us, what it has meant for us moving forward, and how the clinic is actually making that come to life.
Well, the Commission made 94 recommendations that are called calls to action. So when the Commissioner, then Justice Sinclair, now Senator Sinclair, released the report, he said, we have described for you a mountain, we have shown you a path to the top, we call upon you to do the climbing. So the climbing are the 94 calls to action, at a minimum anyway. And they're all encompassing. They include government, they include education, institutions, individuals, the United Nations.
And I understand they're based on a document, some of them from a United Nations document that has been produced.
So that's effectively a roadmap for all of us to follow. So as an organization, the Legal Clinic looked at the 94 calls to action and then evaluated our own practices, policies, procedures, and said, what specifically applies to us? What changes do we need to make to decolonize?
Right.
So in other words, so much of what we do is a result of this history, and there is unconscious bias, there are unintentional not necessarily discrimination in the work that we do. It certainly can be, but it's not inclusive. It excludes the original peoples of this land in many cases. So
how did you begin to unpack that to sort of reframe how you do your work in a society where essentially we've come and settled on top of people who were here before, to sort of take that apart and rebuild together?
I think it's important to understand that we're just scratching the surface right now. And it's important to acknowledge as well that those calls to action come from the stories and the voices and the truth of Indigenous people who are survivors from the Canadian Indian residential school system. Just one part of the horrific legacy of abuse that was forced on Indigenous people in Canada. And those calls to action also, important to recognize, really mimic the conversations that we've been, as Indigenous people, have been having around our fires and our lodges, at our kitchen tables, in front of the television for many, many years. And it wasn't until the government appointed this commission that they called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that finally Canadians started to listen to our stories, listen to those conversations that we've been having. So when we go through and dissect those 94 calls to action, they're exactly the conversations that we've been having for a long time. But it's nice that now somebody has put a voice of authority to those conversations, because these are the things that we have been talking about.
Right, so they're painful but empowering at the same time, because now it's an opportunity to say, yes, we're being listened to. And how beautiful that as a legal clinic, where you're talking about justice and you're figuring out what works for people and what doesn't, that this is a really important thing for a clinic to be doing. So if you could, we've got about 3 minutes left in this section, sort of talk about reconciliation specifically and how that came to be and how the clinic is really moving forward.
It's an acknowledgement that it's important to be educated, it's important to understand the issues and the history, but more importantly, to take action. So reconciliation, if it's going to be effective, has to be based on action. So that's where it comes from. A report that we did for ourselves, we called A Journey to Reconciliation. So that was the analysis of the 94 calls. What changes did we need to make as an organization? It started with things like calls to action number 80 that talks about National Aboriginal Day becoming a holiday.
Okay.
As an organization, we declared it. It takes place in June. We declared that a holiday for staff because it's symbolic of that larger need to engage in a collective reconciliation. June 21st.
Okay.
And it's a recommendation. It's been a recommendation long before the TRC talked about it.
Yeah.
It's been recognized as a day nationally, but it's not a holiday.
A holiday.
So it elevates it to a different...
So in the clinic, that is a holiday.
It is a holiday.
That is a day that the clinic is closed.
Yes.
And that is just putting into action number 80 from the...
Yes.
There you go.
And we've made changes like how do we recruit staff
Yeah.
and board members. We want to be totally inclusive.
Yeah.
So we want to reach out to Indigenous peoples so that folks are seeing us as a safe place.
So that's one thing. We've got about a minute left before we go to break. So how do you begin to build trust when there's been so much pain, so much heartbreak, so much that is broken? How do you begin to build that kind of trust so that we can do the kinds of things you're talking about? Because that's not an easy thing.
For us at the clinic, it's very important that we work with the Indigenous community and our Indigenous community partners, and we're constantly working on that trust-building relationship. So that means consulting with the Indigenous community and the Indigenous community partners that we have. And everything that we do, in particular with the I Am Committed and I Am Affected campaigns, all of the Indigenous community partners are part of this movement forward that educates the city of Hamilton. We're also engaged in developing partnerships with non-Indigenous agencies and organizations like the city of Hamilton, like the Art Gallery of Hamilton as well,
So
and providing those opportunities for people to come in and get educated on these things.
That's fabulous. We're going to throw to a break. We're going to be back with Lyndon George and Hugh Tye from the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic to continue this important conversation.
For 25 years, you've been helping to make our roads safer by doing the right thing. You've been the designated driver, you've stayed over, called home, you've called a cab or a friend, and planned ahead. Let's keep doing the right thing. Support sober driving by getting yourself and your friends home safely.
Do the right thing.
Visit arrivealive.org to find out more. Arrive Alive. Drive sober.
Mom, here's the mail.
Thanks, sweetie.
Mom, can I grab $20 from you today?
Yeah, sure, that's okay.
Cool, thanks.
Welcome back to Vital Signs. We're here with Hugh Tye and Lyndon George from the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, having a conversation about Indigenous justice and truth and reconciliation, and how the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic is making great strides in having us move through truth and reconciliation in ways that are meaningful and are actually going to make a difference. So at this point in the conversation, I'd like to talk about Yen Dene. It's a program, a project that means you and I will go there together, if I'm getting that correctly.
Yes.
And so can you just tell us a little bit about, well, a lot about what it means and how the clinic is doing this?
Okay, Yen Dene is a Mohawk phrase.
Okay.
So it's loosely translated as you and I will go there together, but that is the symbolic understanding that it is a collaborative journey that we are on. We're talking about reconciliation and what does that mean, and also building trust. We recognize that as a non-Indigenous, government-funded justice organization, there's a lot of mistrust in the Indigenous community. We are not a place that people would naturally go to for assistance, and so we need to spend a long time building trust. And we see the way to do that is to bring in and work with members of the Indigenous community. So an advisory committee was established in 2013. And one of the first things that we did as an advisory committee was to hire Lyndon in the Indigenous Justice Coordinator role, because we knew that we needed a lot of support in building that trust, and that as non-Indigenous people, we were not going to be able to do that.
So it was acknowledging your place in this role. You didn't come in as, we have the answers, here's what we're going to do to fix things.
Yes.
You came in with a humility that said, we have a lot to learn and we don't have all the answers.
Absolutely. And in fact, it was an Indigenous member of our board of directors who said, after looking at annual funding applications and the programming that we were doing, she said, I don't see my community here.
Yeah.
Basically challenge staff to, what are you going to do?
And did you get all defensive and say, well, we're doing as much as we can? Or
well, we knew it was complicated.
Yeah.
And so the first thing we had to do was to engage with community and collaborate. We knew this wasn't something we could do on our own.
Right.
And so that's the role of Lyndon to help us do that.
So Lyndon, tell us a little bit, well, a lot about how your role coming into the clinic, what you've done, how the work has played out, what it's meant.
I think it's very important to recognize first that the Hamilton Community Clinic was on board with reconciliation long before the calls to action came out, because they immediately accepted responsibility and held themselves accountable to start an Indigenous initiative that would assist Indigenous people in accessing various forms of legal services.
So the actual work of
through
the clinic, you sort of looked at that and said, we need to reach out to this community and make
That's
it a place
right.
where Indigenous people can feel safe and supported
That's
before
right.
the
That's
recommendations.
right. So my job is to make sure that the Indigenous people who contact me get access to those services. But also my mandate is to continually work on building the relationship of trust between the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic and the Indigenous community. So we do that in partnership with Indigenous and non-Indigenous agencies. Here in the city of Hamilton, with the Indigenous agencies, we're working with places like the Native Women's Center, the Hamilton Regional Indigenous Center, Friendship Center, the Dayswada Desne Aboriginal Health Center, House in Sacagawea, Nawassa, and all of the various Indigenous agencies. We partner together to assure that we're collectively meeting the needs holistically for people who are accessing services. So we're meeting the physical, the spiritual, the mental, and the emotional needs of people. So we develop those partnerships with the Indigenous agencies.
So can I ask a question about how the clinic then, in terms of saying we are going to decolonize and we are going to create a space that is safe, that is inclusive, that meets the spiritual, emotional, physical needs, how you actualize that in the clinic? Are there things that you needed to do with the space, with processes?
Well, I think part of feeling welcome when you enter a space and included is that you need to see some visual cues that this is a space you can trust.
Okay.
So if you're not seeing the face of someone who you might identify with your community, which we have done, then you need to see signs on the walls.
Okay.
So we have a welcome wall that has 2 Indigenous languages welcoming people to the space, along with a lot of other languages.
Okay.
We also have a drum that contains the logo of Yondane, which is 2 feathers.
Yeah.
We actually changed the color of the waiting room
Really?
to reflect what our community partners identified as important to that space feeling welcoming.
I think these are really important things for people, particularly non-Indigenous people, to know, because you can hear about a report that makes recommendations that says things should happen.
Right.
But then how do you tease that apart? How do you actually begin to put into practice things that are meaningful and are not tokens, or to say, well, we have an Indigenous Justice Coordinator, but if you get to the clinic and Lyndon's not there to welcome you, you've actually set an intention that says that you mean business in a meaningful way. And I find that it actually gives me goosebumps to talk about and think about it.
So what we did when I got on board is we brought in all the community agency, Indigenous community agencies and organizations who have representation at a committee called PANG, which is a Professional Aboriginal Advocacy Networking Group. And we brought them in and asked them, on behalf of your clients, would your clients feel welcomed walking into this space?
So they're in the space, they're looking at it.
They're looking at it, and we walked around in Universally, the answer was no. It felt too institutionalized. And if there's one thing that we can recognize as Indigenous people is that institutionalized feeling that we've always been pushed into before.
And that would reinforce trauma. That would reinforce things that are very negative.
So we asked for very physical recommendations, what colors would work, and natural colors worked. And what are some of the other things that we can do that can make the space more welcoming for not just Indigenous people, but for all people coming into the space? And that was a great improvement. That was a great undertaking.
Amazing. I love that.
And all users of the clinic are asked if they identify as Indigenous, and sometimes there's resistance, and so we explain.
There's resistance from where?
Well, because of the mistrust, I think if an Indigenous person is asked to identify, their first reaction could be why? What is the danger here?
Yeah.
And
what am I exposing myself to?
So we explain about Yandere and our desire to provide better and more effective services to all users of the clinic, and particularly members of the Indigenous community. So we do recognize that over time we have increased the number of people who have felt safe enough to trust us and come in and request services of various kinds. So that's been...
So you know it's working. It's not, and that's the other thing that's a good litmus test, because if you try things, and if they weren't working, it sounds like you would be willing to redirect and try something different. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to move into some of the other programs, the I Am Committed, I Am Affected project. That did it start last year?
The I Am Affected campaign started about 2 years ago.
2 years.
Yes.
And the I Am Affected started in response to, it's an educational tool to hopefully spark interest for people to investigate some of the things that are mentioned on the poster campaign. So some of the things that are mentioned right across the board, there will always be Canadian Indian residential schools, because we know now that so much has come out of Indigenous people being thrown and locked into Indigenous residential school. So they address racism, discrimination, murdered and missing Indigenous women.
The posters.
The posters do. And the new one that we're launching on June 1st this year is going to address two-spirited people who are the Indigenous queer nation, because also looking at the truth and the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we're able to recognize that there's certain Indigenous groups that are not mentioned in those calls to action. And the Indigenous queer population were not mentioned in that specific list of recommendations.
So
and it's very important that we have to pay attention, because through Canadian Indian residential schools, homophobia was introduced to our communities for the first time. So that was a response for the Indigenous community. I Am Committed was a response to our allies, recognizing that our allies wanted to participate somehow. So we introduced I Am Committed so that our allies could also commit themselves publicly to doing some work with those calls to action, even if it's just reading the 94 calls to action, because I believe that if people just read those calls to action, something is going to spark interest, and they'll do some self-investigation, a deeper look at
and
those
that's a
calls
very
to
important point that you raised, and we only have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to ask each of you to think about, if you're talking to people or people are thinking about this, you mentioned one is to read the recommendations, read the 94 recommendations. What are other things that people can do, especially in terms of self-reflection? I think it's easy for us to say, here's a problem, here's what I think can be the solution, either throwing money at it but what are some things that people can do to actually make a difference?
Well, the I Am Committed campaign, which is, this is a poster from it, is an important first step. As you say, it's reading the calls to action, the 94, and making a public commitment to them, so to actualizing them. And I think a lot of individuals feel, well, this is a government issue, this is an institutional issue.
Or it's too big,
it's too big. I'm overwhelmed. So I think the important part is to acknowledge that it requires all of us as individuals, as well as collectively, to embark on this collective journey, this collaborative journey. And it also means starting to take advantage of opportunities within community, the Indigenous community, to attend events, get to know people, begin to have those discussions, get to know each other in a different way.
Yeah. They're not always going to be comfortable conversations, but they need to happen.
They're necessary conversations.
absolutely
So we've
necessary.
made it really simple for people to commit themselves by going on to our website, iamcommitted.ca, and you can make yourself your own poster and print it out and post it up at home, post it up at work, your place of business, and then initiate conversation and start educating. I think that we have to also remember that it's taken many, many years for us to get to this point to start talking about.
It's going to take a long time for us to
We have
to get
many
where
years
we're at.
of hard work
Yeah.
ahead of us.
I can't believe that we're already at the end of our time. Hugh, Lyndon, thank you so much for coming back to have a deeper discussion about this. I think this is the first of, or the second of maybe many more conversations.
I hope so.
Hope so.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Celeste.
I'm Celeste Licorish for Vital Signs. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.